Good evening, and welcome to another edition of The Boogeyman. On today's episode, I wanted to talk a little bit about the new game from Bloober Team, Layers of Fear 2. Now, the interesting thing about Layers of Fear 2 is I feel like it's a game that listened a little too much to its critics. And what I mean by that is I actually quite adored Layers of Fear 1. I'll post a link to the review of that one. And what I found interesting is it really embraced the idea of the interactive narrative. In fact, so much so that there wasn't a whole lot of game per se. And it's a part of what some people refer to as a walking simulator. And people use that term in quite a derogatory manner. And I feel that's a little bit unfair. What I mean by that is what people usually mean when they refer to something as a walking simulator is that it's not enough of a game. I think what they're missing is that it is actually playing a little less in terms of the gaminess of games and playing a little bit closer to what I would refer to as kind of an interactive storytelling. And that's what's in display for most of Layers of Fear 2. There's not a whole lot of gameplay per se. You pretty much are moving from point A to point B, making some very basic decisions on whether to follow the director or not. Let's just stop there for a second because I actually want to throw a huge amount of kudos to Layers of Fear for actually hiring Tony Todd to do the role of the director.
Heavy cost.
I think that makes the role very creepy and very ethereal. Tony Todd has this very mythic voice. Anyone who's seen him in Candyman or any of his films really know that he carries this very deep, booming voice that carries a lot of presence. And in Layers of Fear 2, there's actually a lot of kind of kudos to the horror nerd that way. There's Tony Todd who voices the director. There's some references to Seven, The Shining within the game. And that made me really emphatically happy that it's basically a game made by what is obviously horror lovers. People are very passionate about the horror genre as a whole, and it shows. And I quite appreciate that. But getting back to the idea of interactive fiction, one thing I did not really appreciate was this emphasis on we have to make this a game. There's a couple sections where the player encounters this weird formless monster that kind of chases after you. And here is where it becomes very obvious that they wanted to kind of add a little bit of gameplay. Because basically, as you're running away, you have to kind of make your way through a maze. Now, the problem with that mechanic is that they don't really explain to you very well where you're supposed to go. In terms of those scenes, I had no real sense of where I was supposed to go. Half the time you have to turn around and backtrack and go down past that. We even weren't there before. And it made it very kind of frustrating. There's even a few points where you can't, like the formless creature kind of comes up from the ground and it doesn't immediately appear to be the formless creature that you're supposed to run away from. So it's not really telegraphed very well. And I've actually died a few times just because I was watching this creature come up from the ground thinking it was part of the story, and then he caught me because it was the creature I was supposed to run away from. There are some basic music cues when he appears, but considering kind of the texture of the music, it can be very easily confused as just a part of the normal soundtrack. There's another sequence of events that is a little bit stolen from another game by Bloober Team that I quite liked by the name of Observer, where you're kind of running around from these spotlights that are going back and forth on the screen. And that wasn't quite as bad because it was very obvious what you had to do. Sometimes the path required a little bit of kind of figuring out, but for the most part of that sequence was a little bit better because it was more obvious. But like I said, the monster kind of got annoying after a while. I won't lie, whenever I seen that formless monster creature come up, I got a little peeved. Fuck that guy. Seriously, fuck that guy. But with all the negative I can say about that creature and that emphasis on actually playing a game where you can actually die, I had to reload a save file quite repeatedly because of that creature. For all that I can say negative that way, I have to actually say overall, I actually really adored Layers of Fear 2. I feel like I said, it's definitely a game by horror lovers for horror lovers. And, you know, considering the nature of my channel, it should be fairly obvious that that is definitely my jam, so to speak. I do find it interesting, though, that they tried really hard to make it a game. I feel like its strengths was as an interactive story. In the same way in Layers of Fear 2, it felt like being a game wasn't its strong point. Being an interactive fiction was its strong point. And because of that, I really hope that the genre of the walking simulator isn't seen as something really as negative as some players view it as, because I feel like a game like the Telltale series of games really emphasized this idea of story first. You know, and even the gameplay kind of emphasized the story, and was kind of a way to make people think about the story that they were playing. I feel like that's a very underrated thing. I feel like that's kind of the intersection where video games actually kind of become art to a degree, where the poetics and the characterization and the metaphors and just all of those fictive elements become kind of at the forefront of the tapestry that these artists are trying to create. And it's no accident that Layers of Fear 1 and 2 are both about artists. In Layers of Fear 1, you play as a painter who's kind of losing his mind, and in Layers of Fear 2, you play as an actor who's trying to find their role and basically has kind of gotten a little bit insane in the process. That's no accident that both of these films have an artist as a protagonist, because I feel like both of them are very much so trying to get at the more fictive, the more metaphoric elements that a video game can portray. And I really, you know, in terms of the debate about whether or not video games can be art, I'm of the firm camp that yes, they can very well be art, as long as the artists involved take that idea seriously, that video games can be art, and really try to tell a story with all of those fictive elements in play. And I feel like Layers of Fear 2 definitely captures that for the most part. I will say that the monsters that roughly amount to about 5 minutes of overall gameplay in a game that takes at least about 5 hours to beat, you know, I think that's, I'd be nitpicking to say that they're an obstacle to enjoying the game. They're not really an obstacle to enjoying the game. In fact, there's also a new game plus mode that unlocks once you beat it, where you can actually just go through at your own pace and pick which chapters you go through, and kind of, you know, if you want to avoid those scenes, then you very well can, to kind of step back and hunt down all the little bits of story and lore that you may have missed, of which there's quite a few elements in the game. There's objects everywhere, that like posters and little film things that you can put in a projector, and objects that just basically add a little bit of narrative, and all of these little items that you can collect that add a little bit of the lore and the story about this very haunted actor character. In terms of how I would rate Layers of Fear 2, I would say I would definitely highly recommend the game for any horror lover. I feel like if you're not into the horror genre, it might not be the game for you per se. I think you have to at least be a little bit of a horror nerd to enjoy it. There's a lot of references that a horror enthusiast will get that the casual horror fan may or may not. I feel like some of the references they make, though, are kind of pop culture enough that I think even people who are not necessarily horror fans might pick up. You know, a movie like Seven or The Shining is not exactly obscure by any stretch of the imagination. These aren't necessarily very obscure pieces of horror cinema. And there is kind of a little bit of a reference as well to within the game to the original Layers of Fear. There's in the original Layers of Fear, there was all this fruit that kind of became this weird populated thing that kind of took over the scene, and they do that again here with these apples that are floating in space as you're making your way through. And there's even this scene where you walk into a room with a canvas on an easel, very much so like the main hub world of Layers of Fear 1. So yeah, there's a lot of references within the game. And I have always been kind of a sucker for those referential pieces. Things like Cabin in the Woods, which made reference to a ton of horror movies. And if anyone was a horror enthusiast watching Cabin in the Woods, there are references to Hellraiser, references to The Hills Have Eyes, references to Evil Dead, Cabin in the Woods, which is kind of immediately makes you think of Evil Dead if you know the story of that one. And Layers of Fear 2 definitely plays in a very playful manner with references. If you're a horror fan at all, I think you'll catch quite a few of them. And even if you're just a casual horror fan, I think you'll catch a few. But I do feel like if you're not in on the kind of Halloween, creepy, spooky sort of vibe that Layers of Fear 2 offers, I can see people it not really being their thing. I don't know why you would buy a game called Layers of Fear 2 if you don't really enjoy at least a little bit of horror. I feel like it's a little bit like watching Evil Dead and saying, well, this has a lot of gore and creatures in it. It's like, well, it's called Evil Dead. Of course it does. But yeah, I digress. So that's my view on Layers of Fear 2. I highly recommend the game to anybody who wants to have a spooky good time. Even if you just want a little bit of a spooky good time, or just want an interesting story, I recommend it on those regards as well. The only thing I will say is that if you're expecting kind of like a Call of Duty first-person shooter action horror, no, this is definitely not your thing. It's a very methodical walk through metaphor and fiction and storytelling in a way that I actually thought was quite thoroughly enjoyable. So that's my view on Layers of Fear 2. So if you want to check out Layers of Fear 2, it's available on Xbox, PC. I believe it's available for PS4 as well. I highly recommend it. I think it was an enjoyable, fun, good time. Except for that monster. Fuck that guy. So if you like what you've seen, if you want to see me do more reviews, if you want to see me just basically show up more often, I know I've been away for a while. Like, subscribe, comment below. Let me know that you have a thing. This is the Boogeyman, signing off. Ooh.